a neurotransmitter. Anything that a nerve cell produces and can release at its terminal buds or the terminal ends is their product. And because it's a nerve cell, the product is termed a neurotransmitter. So they have to make their products, meaning they're going to need nutrients. And then the other part about this huge blood supply, does our nerve areas, does our nervous system as a whole ever stop? Not until death. It's working 24/7, 365, 366 if it's a leap year. So, it's busy. It's got to be very well supplied. So the blood supply is heavy to the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves. So it has a wonderful blood supply. When we talk about its structure, we divide it into different regions. We divide it into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. So these are what are termed the regions. When we look at what I mentioned earlier, those enlargements that are present, we have the cervical and the lumbar because we have to supply the nerves to upper extremities, lower extremities. When the cord tapers, because the tapering does look like a cone, they term it the medullary cone that it tapers to. Like I mentioned before, the bundle of nerves that look like all these strings, that is our cauda equina. The spinal cord, just like pretty much all other structures we've studied up to this point, it's going to have connective tissue wrappings. For the spinal cord, they're termed the meninges. Now, does that bring anything to mind? What makes it make you think about?
When your nerve comes out of your spinal cord and like starts to hurt, and then you grow like a little ball on your back from the nerve getting out of your spinal cord.
Oh, okay, so like a herniated disc.
Yeah.
And the little bulging that's going to take place. Anything else come to mind? Meningitis? Sure you've heard that, right? Okay. This is what it's talking about. This would be the area that would occur. Itis means inflammation, okay? So it's actually inflammation of the meninges. It can be very deadly for people. As we look at these wrappings that occur, like I said, pretty much for everything else in the body that we've looked at, there's three, okay? There's an outer, there's a middle, there's an inner. The outermost layer is called the dura mater, M-A-T-E-R. The dura mater is a very tough outer membrane. It's going to be the one that's right there with the bone that's encasing the brain and the spinal cord. It's going to form a sleeve that we term the dural sheath. Now, what they've learned about this area, okay, the protection that we're getting, we're going to have some space termed the epidural space. It's between the sheath and the bones. This is an area where people can get epidurals. That's the name for it, okay? Some people at the time of birth can get them, because they can inject anesthesia at this point and you don't feel anything. And that's much better than the old way that they used to do it, which they still can, okay, which would be the spinal tap. Ever heard of that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, lots of people you can still do that, okay. Epidural just gives a little more control over the areas that actually get paralyzed. With the dural tap, with the spinal tap, you actually have the whole body, and you have to lay still and flat for so many hours after you get it, or it can cause damage and that sort of thing, okay, but people still get them. The middle portion, the middle layer, is our arachnoid mata. Arachnoid means spiders, so it has a very spider web appearance. We have an area that's called the subarachnoid space, sub meaning just below, okay? This is going to be the area that will be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid, we're going to get to, I think, in the next chapter, but this is what gets to wash over the brain and the spinal cord. It's a very important fluid. The innermost layer, the pia mater, when you look at the brain and the spinal cord, the brain has a lot of structure to it. It's got a lot of structure. The pia mater is going to run along these structures. It's going to be very tight to the tissue itself, okay? Has a glossy appearance. Really cool when you dissect the brain to be able to like pull it up and look under and cut it away. It's really cool. And so the pia mater, what that's going to do, it's going to help with something called the terminal phylum, where we're going to see the medullary cone taper. One of those nerves that runs through that cauda equina is still carrying this tissue. And they term that the terminal phylum, terminal meaning end, okay? Because these tissues, these meninges, do not exit the bone. These meninges do not exit the bony tissue around the brain and the spinal cord. I know. It's like, whoa, what? Yeah, it allows for the exit of the spinal nerve, but these meninges don't follow. That's why we have the myelin. We're going to see that terminal phylum is going to meet with dura mater to create a coccygeal ligament. That's the very end. Okay, that's the end of the bony structure that's present for the protection. Denticulate ligaments. Dent, okay, dentist, all right, so they look like teeth. They are going to be extensions along the cord. They're going to actually be to the bone so that we get an anchoring of the spinal cord. Because the one thing we don't want, just like for the brain, we don't want the brain just freely moving around in the skull, because it would be bouncing to the sides and everything, and basically we would stay in a permanent concussion. We do not want the same thing for the spinal cord. We want it to be anchored and cushioned, which is what the meninges and the spinal fluid are going to do. It's going to offer some cushioning. At the areas of roughly L3, L4, L4, L5, they can do what's called a lumbar puncture. Ever know anybody that had one of those? What, were they really sick? Were they looking to see if they could identify bacteria or viruses or something? Okay. Did they happen to say like how painful it might have been? Or were they aware that it was being done? They were aware. Yeah. Did they mention any of the pain or anything? No.
Yeah, it's not really
I understand it's painful to have it done.
use all that time.
Right, yeah. Like she's saying, huge long needle. And once they get it in, they have the little end that's open. And basically the fluid gets to just basically drip into a test tube until they can actually collect enough to be tested. Yeah.
And it didn't seem like they were in pain when they did the needle, but
Maybe they do something there. 'Cause I think now they like spray it and everything.
well, I think they, they on the skin.
Yeah.
At the injection point.
Hopefully the person doing it knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. So, lumbar punctures collect CSF that they can use for trying to determine, because some, people can be very sick and they need to try to help determine what the bacteria or virus and treatment should be. One of the things that I've pointed out, we're going to find the gray matter and the white matter. In gray matter, myelin is present, it's just not as abundant. The fibers, I should say the axons of a nerve are simply resting in myelin. They're not totally encased, okay? This would be my site of synaptic contact. Let's take that apart. Synaptic. Any idea what that might mean? Uh-huh.
Like the bridge area where it's like crossing over.
Okay, so if you think back to what you've studied to this point, okay, do you guys remember that neuromuscular junction? And there was this little area that was called the synapse, okay, the synaptic cleft, okay? So this is going to be my area of synapse, all right, synaptic contact between a neuron and the area of integration. The gray matter that it's talking about, for some activities that our body will carry out, the actual integration, meaning making sense of the information that came in, to get the response, will occur at the level of the spinal cord. It does not have to go all the way to the brain, which is kind of cool. Okay? That's a reflex. Not all reflexes have to be processed by the brain. It can actually come from the level of the spinal cord, which I think is kind of cool. It does look like it's a butterfly. It contains what we say are posterior or dorsal horns. If you begin to look posterior versus anterior, do you kind of see the horns that they're talking about? Now here's another question I have. On these posterior horns, what does it look like the rootlets are doing? Looks like it attaches directly to the horn, to that gray tissue. They are. The rootlets on the posterior side are actually meeting up with this posterior horn. But what about those anterior rootlets?